No two people are alike. This is a phrase often used to reassure people that though their peers might think of them as weird, it's not a bad thing. However, this phrase is only used to compare two separate persons, or so it seems. Another possible use for it would be comparing oneself now to how one was years ago. And I'll use myself as an example. When I was 8, I was like many boys that age. I created a little bit of trouble for my teachers. I occasionally got into time out for misbehavior. But I was enjoying life. By the age of 18, I wasn't a troublemaker, but I was facing many of the challenges of adolescence, and I had my rough times. Now, at the age of 28, I'm married, loving life as much as I did as a child without creating trouble, and I'm better able to manage the challenges that I face. 3 different points in my life, and 3 different personas, or people, present, as it were. And the same is true for everyone else as well. Who we were as young children is not necessarily who we are now. For better or for worse, everyone changes. More than just our persons, though, our lives change too. People are born and they pass away. Jobs begin and they end. Places of residence get bigger and smaller. They get further and closer to family and friends, and they have varying decorations and colors on the wall. People get married, sometimes they divorce. The list goes on, but suffice it to say, changes happen to everyone and everything. For better or for worse, change is a part of life. And change, the theme of the reading from Mark today, is what I want to focus on. But before we get to the story of the Transfiguration itself, I feel it is important that we look at the verses leading up to the Transfiguration. A few verses earlier is the famous passage of Jesus asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And shortly after that, "But who do you say that I am?" And to the first question, one of the answers given is Elijah. Now, as we saw in the 2 Kings passage, Elijah is taken up into the heavens on a chariot of fire led by horses of fire. At this point in time, it sparks a legend that Elijah's ascent happened in this way because Elijah was going to return. So already people are viewing Jesus, for the miracles he had performed thus far, as Elijah reborn. Another answer to that first question, though, is one of the prophets. And theologians believe that this answer of one of the prophets could very well be in reference to one prophet in particular, Moses. If we look at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses' grave wasn't known to anyone at that time. It's still not known to anyone in the present day. And because of its mysterious nature, it sparked a similar legend as that which surrounded the ascent of Elijah. People believed that Moses would return, and some of them actually believed that Elijah was Moses reborn. So in other words, people are thinking that Jesus is either Moses reborn, Elijah reborn, or, for those that bought into Elijah being Moses reborn, that Jesus is Elijah reborn from Moses. As for to the second question, "Who do you say that I am?" the answer that's given to him is the Messiah. Now, it needs to be noted that although they are saying the right word, who they believe the Messiah to be is sort of false. Messiah derives from the Hebrew word to anoint. It means anointed one. Saul was a Messiah, an anointed one. But his reign as king ended very poorly. David was an anointed one. David was a Messiah, so to speak. And while he was a faithful follower, he was also a common man, capable of sinning, and he was one who did sin fairly regularly. People in that day and age thought of the Messiah, therefore, to be just this average human, however divinely inspired or given divine gifts to a certain extent. This then leads into the story of the Transfiguration, one of the greatest set of changes in the Bible. And I say set of changes because the Transfiguration has more than one change present. The first change, worth noting, the most obvious change, is Jesus' appearance. When they go up the mountain, the cloud appears, and Jesus' garments begin to glow. To a certain extent, Jesus, who has only been seen as wholly human up until this point, now physically displays his wholly divine nature. And this physical change of Jesus' appearance, then causes a second change. And the biggest change of all, as it were. The second change is the disciples' perception of Jesus. As I mentioned before, the disciples, along with the rest of humanity, thought that Jesus was just your average human, with some special gifts, nothing more. Now that Jesus' divine side is open and apparent, quite literally shining in their faces, the disciples' understanding of who Jesus is changes, and this perception or understanding is reinforced by two other things that happen while they're on the mountain. The first thing that happens as a reinforcement is the appearance of both Elijah and Moses. So all three of them, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, are in the same place at the same time. Therefore, there's an understanding that Jesus is neither Elijah reborn nor Moses reborn, let alone Moses reborn as Elijah reborn as Jesus. Also, though, the wording in that instance is very specific on who is talking. Elijah and Moses are talking to Jesus, not vice versa. And while we don't know what is being said by the two figures, some theologians theorize that Elijah, who represents the prophets, and Moses, who represents the law, are praising Jesus to dictate that Jesus is in fact the fulfillment of both all of the prophecies given by the prophets and all of the promises made by the law to Moses. So that's the first reinforcement. The second reinforcement is the divine voice that we hear only one other time in Jesus' life. At Jesus' baptism, it says, "This is my son with whom I am well pleased." This time, it says, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." God is claiming Jesus as being the only begotten Son of God. With that declaration comes the reinforced understanding that Jesus, the fulfillment of the prophets and the law, is wholly God and wholly human, and therefore has not just authority, but divine authority. So the disciples' perceptions and understanding of Jesus also change here. Now, the third and final change is the theme of Jesus' ministry from this point forward. 2 out of the 3 predictions of his death happen after the Transfiguration has taken place. The first prediction of his death taking place very shortly before the Transfiguration. From this point, Jesus also begins to tell of the end times more often. And when he does so in this very graven and horrific description. Thirdly, we also begin to see more of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, all of these people who are trying to trick Jesus. This all represents a change in Jesus' ministry, or at least that which is recorded of it. Suffice it to say, this is a story of change. And who better to exemplify that change, to bring it into being, than Jesus? Jesus, in fact, changed the world. Our salvation is no longer dependent on our actions, but on divine election because of Jesus. Our covenant is no longer entered into by means of circumcision, but now by baptism of the Spirit. Our slavery to sin has ended with Christ's sacrifice on the cross. All these changes and more have happened because of Jesus and everything that Jesus said and did. So, knowing that Jesus is willing to make the sacrifices he did to change the world like he did for all humanity, past, present, future, we must ask ourselves two things. First, what changes are we willing to make to be more like Christ? That is to say, what are we willing to change about ourselves to be more loving, compassionate, giving, and self-sacrificial of time and energy? Secondly, though, what changes are we willing to make to change the world for the better? Is the change we need to make something like speaking up for those who don't have a voice? Is it as hard-fought as, in the wake of the mass shootings we hear about more often than we care to admit, standing and fighting for the preservation of human life? Is it as simple as putting more in the offering plate so that the Church Universal can do more for humanity as a whole? As I said at the beginning, who we once were is not who we necessarily are now. And who we are now is not necessarily who we will be. And who we can be could, in fact, make all the difference in making this world a better place. In the same way, the world is not the same as it once was. Now, make no mistake, the world is still changing. It will continue to change. The world changed because of the words and actions of a single man. Granted, the man was wholly human and wholly divine, but one man changed the world. If we are to follow in Christ's footsteps, we are therein challenged to change the world for the better, for all persons, those living and those yet to come. So, in closing, I ask you, how is God using you to change the world for the better, and what changes does God want you to make, or can you make, so that God's intent will be achieved?